Nothing on the Bonnell Foundation's Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bonnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Viatris, Genentech, and Vertex. Here's your host, Laura Bonnell.
Thanks for joining the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. And, I don't think that I've ever just done a podcast just with me. I usually always have a guest, so I hope you enjoy this. There were just a few things I wanted to share, so here we are. The first thing is, you all know that I have two daughters with cystic fibrosis. Molly's 28 and Emily is 25 years old. And at this point, they are both doing great, which I am really happy about. It's always great to have great news. And I also wanted to talk to you about how things started before I was married, before I had kids, obviously. My plans were to be a radio or a television news reporter, and I ended up doing both. I was in radio for 25 years and did television and wrote for newspapers and magazines and did all of that stuff. And it was wonderful. And my plans were I thought, maybe I'll do some international reporting, and was going to go wherever this career took me. And the 1 year that I was burned out from reporting, I went and worked for the United Way in Ann Arbor, and actually found out that I did not like doing public relations, but I needed a break from reporting. It was so intense, and I really wanted to try something else. When I was at the United Way, I met somebody with cystic fibrosis, Jeff, and he was working in the lab at the University of Michigan, and he was working for Dr. Francis Collins, the former director of the NIH. And most of you will remember through COVID, he was the director of the NIH, Dr. Fauci's boss. And then in 1989, when I was dating my husband and my father had recently died, the gene that causes cystic fibrosis, the whole genome project happened that Dr. Francis Collins was a part of. And I was there because we were working on a piece for print media all about the United Way and the agencies that they supported. And one of those was the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And this was the local foundation, not the national foundation that's in Bethesda. So I was working there, and that's when the Genome Project came about. That discovery hit the news, and I was there for that, for the United Way, making sure if the media had any questions from an agency standpoint, a disease standpoint, that I could send them in the right direction. And it was great seeing all my media friends that were up there, and again, realized, what am I doing here? I need to be back as a news reporter. But at the time, I didn't know the impact that cystic fibrosis was going to have on my life. And looking back, I definitely see it was a God thing, absolutely the direction of where my life was going. And so I was there for that news conference, and Dr. Collins was there. And I remember at that time, fast forward to when I was interviewing Dr. Collins, I think in 2018, they thought it was going to be so huge that this holds the answer to cystic fibrosis, and it didn't. It was eons later, because it was 2019, when the specialty drug came out that corrects the underlying condition of cystic fibrosis. But then it was huge, and it had held so much potential. So Joe and I get married, and we're thinking, that we're going to have a lot of kids. I had been going on so many breaking news stories, the Dearborn Post Office shooting, the Royal Oak Post Office shooting. I was at fires. I went jogging with President Clinton. I met lead guitarist Joe Perry of Aerosmith. I interviewed and talked to rocker Ted Nugent several times. old-time local rocker Mitch Ryder interviewed Dr. Jack Kevorkian, the assisted suicide doctor, walked and talked and hung out with U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno back then, interviewed First Lady Hillary Clinton at the White House in the East Room, talked to governors, lawmakers, presidential candidates, interviewed Gloria Steinem a couple times, the feminist and activist. I mean, who doesn't know who she is? Helen Thomas, the White House press corps. I interviewed her. I talked to parents after tragic incidents, car accidents, and all kinds of things. So I had done just about every story you can do, from Christmas to Hanukkah to just about everything. And then cystic fibrosis came into our lives. I was on my way to a breaking news story, and we suspected that the girls, or it was Molly at that time, had cystic fibrosis. And I was really trying to get the pediatrician to test her for CF. And she's like, oh, no, you're a first-time mom. Just go back to work. She'll be fine. She doesn't have CF. And after reading more, at 3 months old, I said to the pediatrician, I said, she needs to be tested. I've read more, and I am sure she has cystic fibrosis. So they did do a sweat test with Molly the next day, and I was heading to a breaking news story. I have no recollection of what that breaking news story was, but she said, pull over. And I was like, oh my gosh, I know she has CF. So I pull over, and I'm on one of those enormous cell phones at the time that you had to plug into the cigarette lighter and that whole, shenanigan. And she says, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You're right. Molly has cystic fibrosis. So I went back to the office, went back to the station, said I had to leave, told Joe to meet me at home. And we sat on the porch, drank a beer, cried, and then just said, well, we're just going to raise her to be the happiest and healthy little kid ever. And in those, I think it was 2 hours, we were sitting on the porch. I was like, well, we were going to have 6 kids. And then I kind of thought, well, 6 seems to be an awful lot. But he came from 8 and I came from 3, 2 other siblings. And I thought, well, we could do 4. And now we have 1 child with cystic fibrosis. But we also decided we're going to have 1 more. I mean, a 1 in 4 chance with each pregnancy. How could it happen twice? But it did. So that's when the advocacy started, and we got involved with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. We started at Children's Hospital of Michigan, but moved to the University of Michigan after both girls were diagnosed. And Dr. Nasser asked me to speak about newborn screening because it was really important that cystic fibrosis was put on newborn screening. And it was, but not until 2007. And my girls were born in 1994 and 1997. So the advocacy started soon, early. The first time I spoke about my girls having cystic fibrosis, or first of all, it was just Molly, and it was at the tennis auction ball for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation locally. And I just was crying. My whole family was sitting at a table, and I was up at the podium crying and had to get it together. And, then I was well known in radio, but I just thought, I can't even speak. Like, it's such a huge diagnosis. And then I got it together and I was able to speak, and you just keep growing from all those experiences. But we didn't know we were CF carriers, and both sides of our families were trying to rack their brains to see if anybody had any history of cystic fibrosis. And no one really could think of anything. Joe's mom thought that one of the young cousins or something had died when they were an infant. So maybe they saw that it was something on that side. But obviously, we both had to be carriers for us to pass it on to the girls. So, a lot of guilt in the beginning from parents who were worried that they had passed it on, which they did unknowingly. But there was just no time for blame. You just had to keep moving forward. And so the diagnosis comes. I'm working full-time. Joe's working full-time. And then Emily, at 8 months old, needs to be hospitalized. And that's when you realize both of you cannot possibly work full time and care for children who are chronically ill and are going to need to be hospitalized so many times because you have to be in the hospital with them. Or at least for us, we were able for one of us to be in the hospital. I just couldn't imagine leaving the kids alone and not being able to advocate for them while they were hospitalized. So I decided that I would go part-time in my career so that I could always just say, nope, can't come in this week. The girls are in the hospital. Family reacted really supportively, and how can we help and what can we do? And my mother-in-law either stopped smoking or at least never smoked when the girls were over. And before we had Emily, we thought, oh, could we do in vitro? But, insurance doesn't cover that. And we didn't know how many times we would have to do in vitro. And it was a lot of money. And we appealed to the insurance company to cover it. But even talking to them on a non-emotional level, just as, hey, it's $330,000 a year to have a healthy child with CF, but if you covered in vitro, then we wouldn't have another child with CF. But even the financial side of it didn't appeal to them. So it was a humiliating and really mentally challenging time sitting there with those insurance people. It was a table full of people. It was really traumatic. It didn't feel like you were heard, and it was just completely unbelievable. And the girls know about this, and Joe and I explained it to them. So the other thing, I think when you are in it and you're raising your kids with CF, and now you've gone to this, oh, we're going to eat so healthy, and we're going to have little sandwiches with cucumbers on it, and everything's going to be so healthy. And the doctors are telling you, throw a stick of butter in it, give her ice cream, give them whatever they want, just fatten them up. And Emily had a lot of trouble gaining weight, so we had supplements to make food even fatter and richer and more protein and more fat. And we were doing all this, and so many moms I know, we can all relate. We just sit down and start talking about this. So your kids are getting all this. You're preparing all of this. Mac and cheese with extra cheese and butter, salt, and just everything that's high fat, high calorie. And then we're eating it too. And then we are usually, the moms are doing most of the caregiving, going to the appointments. And so you're eating your emotions, basically. And so most of the CF moms I know, we have had weight issues, and you're buried in going to work, taking care of your kids, everybody healthy. Okay, everyone's sick, taking care of them at school, picking them up whenever there was a CF related stomach ache. You're always on call for your kids, just as a parent, and then add CF on top of it. So you're really busy. Time for yourself and being healthy, I found extremely, extremely challenging. And then you also found at that time, 1994 and 1997, there wasn't a huge role that the CF Foundation had except for raising funds. And really that is what they do now, but they are more parent involved and they have more programs. But back then they said, sorry, we don't have anything for you. We're just a fundraising entity. Sorry, but we've got nothing for you. So then you're left with trying to find out through either the hospital, clinic that you're at, where and how do you connect with parents? And we did go to some support groups that we found were so sad and negative, it wasn't helping our mental health. We needed the reality of the disease, but to deal with it in a positive way. How do we move forward? We get what the disease is, and we're continuing to learn, but this handling it like just thinking about when the end will come, we just couldn't handle. So I knew then when the girls were little that I wanted to start my own foundation, but there was no time to do it at that time with work and everything else that I've talked about. So we did the Great Strides walks, and we raised funds for that, and we raised funds for the University of Michigan, where our daughters were going, so that we could help out that way, and also raised awareness. WWJ radio was great as far as spreading awareness. They always would cover and allow me to cover news stories that related to cystic fibrosis. And my news director always said they're legitimate news stories. We were able to raise awareness about cystic fibrosis a lot. And, it took a long time to be able to finally say, all right, I want to have and start my foundation. So I did that in 2010. And I think the girls were around 12 and 10 years old, something like that. And it was just ready to take that leap. And, we started with $100 or something and started just making our way. And looking back at all the growth and all the programs and the people that we're able to help now, it's really impressive. We give out financial assistance really to anyone that asks, unless you, for some reason, don't meet the criteria. So we're able to help people all the time with financial assistance, medical bills, and we also spread awareness. And then lung transplant grants, we're able to give them a pretty good chunk for a lung transplant grant. And we're also educating on the importance of dental care and how important it is when you are pre-transplant. And we do education grants. And we also have a great supporter of our education grants, someone that found us on the web and really liked what our mission was, and is now giving us $25,000 a year for our education grants, so we can award these to people all over the country and help them with their college expenses. And advocacy has become a huge part of what we do, because there are about 25 million people in the United States with a rare disease. 40,000 people in the U.S. have cystic fibrosis. And there are a lot of things to advocate about, which we'll get into in a little bit. And then the podcasts were a way of kind of staying in my lane. It's radio. It's what I was used to. It's easy for me. I love having guests. I love asking questions. You always learn more, and it's great to share it with other people. And it was important that we raise awareness about cystic fibrosis and people of color. We know people, we've had people on this podcast, and we have people that are featured on our website that were diagnosed late as 54 years old, simply because they were African American and doctors thought it was a Caucasian disease, and that is incorrect. We also started the CF Familia page, which reaches out to the Hispanic community. That whole page is in Spanish, and we have videos and all kinds of things. And we're also going to do an Arabic page that will allow patients to read about cystic fibrosis in Arabic. One thing we found out in talking with people of color is that sometimes they're getting information from either their home country or somewhere where the information isn't accurate, and it can be very scary for them. So we're really trying to get information so that they're able to find accurate information about cystic fibrosis. We're also advocating for people in lower income countries. We have videos on our website about our trip to Egypt. I also did a podcast with a doctor in Thailand. Low income countries, or countries that don't recognize cystic fibrosis right now, have a very young life expectancy. In Egypt, for example, it's 8 years old, and it was just announced to be 56 years old. Today in the United States, if you're born with cystic fibrosis, that's a huge difference, and it's because of access to medications. Part of the problem is the Ministry of Health in some low-income countries don't recognize the disease, and you really have to bring everyone up to speed. The other challenge is getting pharma to lower drug prices. But again, it's everyone. Pharma isn't the bad person in this. Everybody has to work together. The insurance companies, pharma, the actual country, everyone really has to work together to change this. One of the things that I did when I was recently in Washington, D.C. in March of this year, 2023, was talk to senators and representatives about the pharmacy benefit manager and the harm that the pharmacy benefit manager does to the industry. And that is a person who decides what may or may not be covered and for how much. There needs to be transparency in the pharmacy supply chain so that you see everything that goes on. It may be that your drug's in a different tier, and because it's in a different tier, you have to pay more. There's also the alternate funding program, which is bad for patients because in addition to the pharmacy benefit manager, you could have an employer that this AFP approaches, and the employer may not realize that, hey, yes, you're going to save the employer a little bit money, but what it's going to do is actually increase the cost of the drug for the patient and the AFP group that is not at all regulated. They're going to make some money. So it benefits everyone except the patient. So it's really important to advocate. Really important for parents to kind of get on board and to speak up about what needs to be done. We have an education day that's coming up where we want to let people know all these issues, because I think you're not always aware because you're in the midst of it. You're living your life and just trying to keep your kids healthy. But if you don't know about all of these different aspects that are going on in the legislature, you know, we need to take care of some of those issues because you need to set up the world for your kids after you're gone. So many things that we're going to talk about, but advocating for your child and legislation are equally important. Age appropriately advocating for your child and making sure that your child can advocate for him or herself is allowing them to speak up. For example, Emily wanted a blood draw, but she had a very intimidating nurse who scared her. And she was already scared enough about getting her blood drawn. Part of the reason is because the first time she got her blood drawn, as little as she was, the nurse let go of the IV and it started going to the left and to the right and back and forth and back and forth, and blood was just spewing out of it. So not great. So after that, we had to tell her little self, you know, anytime you don't feel comfortable with a nurse, you can look at me, you can look at the nurse, and you can say, I want someone else to do it. But, you know, that is up to you. You do have power as a little 5-year-old. And that was really important. And she did. The nurse wouldn't do the blood draw countdown with her. 3, 2, 1 is all she wanted them to say. And here I go. And this one particular nurse wouldn't. So she said to her, no, I want a different nurse. And we did get a different nurse, but it just gave her a say in what was going on. Another time when I had to speak up, Emily was having repeated fevers over and over again, 104. It was really scary. She was in 7th grade. And I kept insisting that she have a bronchoscopy, which she'd never had before. But I thought there has to be some sort of infection if this keeps happening. And I would say to parents, it's very important to follow your gut because the doctors are wonderful, but they really need to listen to us as the parent because we know what's going on. We see our kid. We are the chief medical expert, so to speak, is kind of what we named ourselves as advocates. So I just kept insisting that she get a bronchoscopy. And finally, the doctor said, okay. She went in and did it. She came out after the procedure and she said, oh my gosh, I am so sorry. Her lungs were full of pus and they had cleaned it out. And really, she hasn't had a fever like that since 7th grade, and she's 25 now. So it's really important that you speak up, you know your kid best, and to advocate for them. So then legislation that we've touched on a little bit, it's really important to know what it's about, because you get really taken advantage of so often that you need to fight and you need to send letters and take visits with legislators so that they can hear you. I can't tell you how wonderful. We talked to 12 senators and representatives in D.C., and of course we talked to our local representatives here and senators also locally. It's good for all of them to hear our voices. We talked with Republicans and Democrats. Everyone listened equally. It was a beautiful thing. And the aides, if you don't get the actual senator or the representative, the aides are great. They're all in their 20s. They're smart and they're listening to you. So it's really important that you do get involved. Step therapy, for example, if you have experienced this, your doctor says, I want your kids on Zithromax or whatever drug it happens to be. And then the insurance company says, well, we want you to try Augmentin first. And you don't want to try Augmentin first. Your child, you may know, does not respond to that drug. But the insurance company dictates it. Even sometimes if your doctor has written on the prescription as written, I want them to have this specific drug, sometimes the insurance companies still don't listen. So step therapy is when you have to try and fail on a drug before you can get the drug that your doctor actually ordered. And again, it's about keeping the doctor-patient relationship, and that is what we're fighting for, and that is why it's so important for parents to speak up when it happens. Either reach out to the Bonnell Foundation or reach out to a foundation in your area and send a note to your legislator and make sure they're aware, like, why is step therapy okay? It really doesn't save anybody any money, and certainly doesn't save anyone any time. I mean, you're working full-time, part-time, whatever it is, and raising your kids. You just don't have time to try this, and then you can get on what your doctor ordered, and then you have to go to the pharmacy a couple times. It's a nightmare. Also, the Institute for Economic and Clinical Review, also known as ICER, that is an organization, a self-appointed organization that is telling insurance companies, we're going to tell you if we feel a drug is worth it. And it's called QALY, Quality Adjusted Life Years. In a nutshell, you can research this more. I have links in our show notes. But what this is, again, they're telling the insurance company what they think is worthy. And they may not find that specialty drugs that are $30,000 a month may not be worth it. Basically, what QALY does is discriminate. It says someone's life, for example, who's in a wheelchair is less worthy than someone who is healthy. So it's a very discriminatory process, and we're working hard to change that. But again, there is so much more to know on it. You can just go in show notes to find out more. Copay accumulator, we're trying to get this banned in the state and across the country. Some states have been successful. What copay accumulator does is, for example, you get a coupon from your doctor or from pharma, and you go to fill your drug at the pharmacy. They take that coupon and it goes to the insurance company. They get paid. You don't get paid. You don't get help with your out-of-pocket. You don't get help with your copay. Again, this is something that doesn't benefit the customer. What is the point? There is no point. The only way that it would be a benefit to the patient is if you got that money. An example is Vertex Pharmaceuticals, which has the specialty drug. They stopped doing that, giving a coupon, because it wasn't going to the patient. And we did a whole podcast about that if you want to listen to that. That is all about the Vertex GPS program, and that's what the podcast is called if you want to look through and find that podcast. But it has to change because the only people that it benefits is the insurance company. And again, no one's anti-insurance. We just have to work together. The pharmacy benefit manager, I did explain a little bit, but that's somebody who's getting paid a lot of money, which nobody is against anybody making a good living. But when it's at the expense of other people and other parts of the insurance process, this is not a good thing. This is, again, not allowing people access sometimes to medications or only at a very high cost. And then the alternative funding program, I told you a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. I will have a link in our show notes about that as well. Prior authorization is a nightmare. Many of you probably experienced this as well, but one of my daughters was sent home from the University of Michigan after one of the worst lung infections that she has ever had. And we had 2 hours to get home, do her IV meds in her PICC line, get to the pharmacy and pick up her oral med of a very expensive drug and make sure she could take it by 6 p.m. When we got to the CVS pharmacy at 5 p.m., first on the phone, because we called ahead, they said, oh, no, it wasn't available. They didn't have it. And then we thought, well, we're going to go inside. So we go inside and they said, well, actually, we do have it, but we can't give it to you because the prior authorization didn't go through. And I said, well, I have no control over that. And she said, well, the pharmacy's closed. They won't give us prior auth till tomorrow. And I said, okay, but I need enough medication. I need the drugs to get her through till tomorrow. I don't want her to relapse. And they said no. And I said, all right. I looked around and they had all these signs hanging from the ceiling that said, the pharmacist is your friend. We want to help you. We're here to support you. And I said, well, then you're going to have to take all these signs down because this is not what I'm experiencing, what these signs are saying up here. And I said, listen, I need some compassion. We cannot leave without the 2 pills that she needs to get through the night. So it was like this uncomfortable standoff. Everyone was being as respectful as possible. And I felt bad for the pharmacist. And eventually she put 2 pills in a container and handed it over. And I said, thank you. And I hoped she wasn't going to lose her job. I mean, I offered to pay for the drugs and she said, no, we couldn't do that. We have 2 primary and secondary insurance. There is not a reason where you should just be standing there begging for medications. So we get home with the pills and I realize I don't know the side effects of this drug. I don't know if she has to take it with food. There's no label. And I had to make sure that on the pill, it said the name of her medication or she couldn't even take it because who knows if she got frazzled and put the wrong drug in there. Thankfully, it was the correct drug and we were able to Google side effects and other things, but it was really scary and completely unnecessary. So even if we wanted to, insurance companies want to keep prior authorization, the system has to get better. This is not how you handle people who have a chronic illness. And then there's the Rare Disease Advisory Council, something that I believe 24 states have passed around the country, and hopefully Michigan will be the 25th. But the Rare Disease Advisory Council just passed the full House and then goes to the Senate Policy Health Committee and then has to be passed by the full Senate and then signed by the governor. What it does is it gives everyone a voice. It gives health insurance a voice. It gives the pharmacy a voice, geneticists, doctors, patients, parents, nonprofits. It's about 21 people in this council. So when a lawmaker says, I'm making a decision about copay accumulator or prior authorization or the PBM, how does this affect the 1 million people in Michigan with a rare disease? Then this council can weigh in and say, here's how, here's why it doesn't work for the rare disease patients that are in your district. So it's really important to learn about all these things so that parents can show their supports. And again, these legislators, they are listening. So after all this, having kids who are now 28 and 25 with cystic fibrosis and the foundation has been around from 2010 to it's now 2023, and we're going strong. We've learned so much. CF modulators keep improving. They're working with mRNA on future CF modulators that will correct the underlying condition of cystic fibrosis. There's so much hope in the future, so parents definitely need to have hope. And then if you're just now starting out and you have a child or children with cystic fibrosis, just remember how important it is to communicate with your spouse. It does get very stressful. And in the beginning, Dr. Nasser told us a lot of families, a lot of parents end up getting divorced because of cystic fibrosis and all the stress that it brings. Joe and I are going to be married 30 years in May, but it is not without struggle. It is not without all that we went through emotionally while dealing with cystic fibrosis and everything that goes into life. So it's really important to have somebody to talk to, get a therapist, have a great support group with your friends. Very important to do that. In regards to our girls' future, the new specialty drug is doing wonders. It's changing the lives of so many people. So much hope now if your child is born with CF. It is not a cure. It does not fix everything. People are still having lung transplants. People are still dying of cystic fibrosis. But there is so much more hope. And people born with cystic fibrosis are living longer lives. Again, that life expectancy extended to age 56 now for people born today. So it is great news. Really important to stay healthy and to keep learning and growing. And I think the other thing is be open to all things CF. You know, you want to hear what people have to say. You want to listen to speakers. You want to see what people are writing on Facebook. And you don't always have to agree with it or participate in a conversation that maybe makes you uncomfortable. But it's really important to be as connected as you're able to with other CF parents. I think one of the best things that we've ever done as a foundation was do the Cystic Fibrosis Masterclass program, which the link is also in the show notes. It featured 12 parents of children and adults with cystic fibrosis and a spouse of somebody with cystic fibrosis, and just all the emotion and different things that parents go through. One dad talked about having faith and how important having faith in God is when you have children with CF. And then another mom talked about losing one of her 2 children who have CF to the disease and going on with the other. And then another parent talks about just the importance of being strong and of being the leader in raising her son with cystic fibrosis. There is so much experience and knowledge that they're able to pass on. So I encourage you, whether you're a new parent or you have children who are older, it's really helpful to listen to the CF Masterclass and watch it, because you'll learn new things all the time. It's so important. And like I've always said, my foundation is my therapy. Talking to other parents is also therapy. You get each other, you learn new things, and you keep growing. So please reach out, talk to other parents, email us at the Bonnell Foundation, even if you're saying, hey, you haven't talked about this on a podcast, we'd like to hear about it. Any other thoughts that you have are always welcome. And just know that you're not in this alone. We're all in this together, and we can all support one another. So thanks for sticking with me on this podcast. I just felt like rambling, I guess, but I just wanted to tell you what was on my mind and to express how important it is that you know about advocating and all of the issues that we as a CF community need to be advocating for. So thank you for your time. The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Viatris, Genentech, and Vertex. It was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now.